it doesn't take a rocket scientist to predict that when you take 50 to 100 milligrams of Dbol per day, your HDL is going to be What's up guys, Derek, moreplaysmoredates.com. Today we're going to be talking about HDL levels on cycle, and specifically in this one study we can see the HDL levels, how bad they get hit from 700 milligrams a week of Dbol, which 50 to 100 milligrams a day is the dosage range that was used. So as high as 100 milligrams per day, 700 per week, 200 milligrams of Deca per week, and 200 milligrams of test per week. So obviously, you're going to expect some pretty significant lipid changes here. And in addition to that, we're going to be looking at how long it took to recover to baseline after that cycle. So this is a really old study, but the unfortunate thing is all the good studies with reasonable dosages that we'd actually want to see clinically evaluated were done decades ago, when anabolics weren't viewed so negatively and got their negative connotation from the media and whatnot. So this study evaluates 3 compounds, which are really interesting: dianabol, testosterone, nandrolone decanoate. So obviously everyone knows that androgens crush HDL. It's kind of like a well-known thing, but this is some of the preliminary research done on it, and some of the dosages used are really insightful for those who are using them for performance enhancement, especially because these dosages are very, very high and at least considerable enough to compare to modern day use among bodybuilders, power lifters, strength athletes, etc. So in this, they had 14 adult white men, 11 were bodybuilders, and 3 were powerlifters. In their lipids and lipoprotein cholesterols were quantified during active physical conditioning, both on for at least a month and off for at least 4 months. Self-administered exogenous androgenic steroids. The subjects took 50 to 100 milligrams methandrostenolone daily. So that is dianabol. That's just the chemical name for dianabol. Dianabol being the trade brand name. 50 to 100 milligrams daily. So that's as much as 700 per week, plus weekly injections of testosterone, 100 to 200 milligrams. So that's like therapeutic replacement, or like, honestly, it's like generous TRT. Realistically, it's like performance enhancing TRT. And nandrolone decanoate, 100 to 200 milligrams per week. Mean HDL-C on exogenous androgenic steroids was 29 milligrams per deciliter, plus or minus 8. So that was severely depressed levels and was less than 50% of the consistently elevated mean HDL-C when exogenous steroids weren't used. So it's normally around 61 plus or minus 14 milligrams per deciliter. So if you're not on gear, around that, and on it, around 29. You can usually see in your blood test markers, you'll probably see 40 being the cutoff for what is generally known as acceptable levels for being somewhat healthy in the HDL department, and 61 would be normal otherwise, 29 being severely depressed. During anabolic steroid use, HDL-C was less than equal the age, race, and sex-specific 10th percentile in 11 of the 14 men, whereas while off of anabolic steroids, HDL-C was greater than equal the 90th percentile in 7 of the 13 men, and in the top quartile for 3 of the remaining 6 men. So basically saying here, when they're on gear, their HDL sucks, and when they're off of gear, their HDL is good. So it's not just that their HDL was bad off of gear and then it got worse on gear, like it was good off of and terrible while on. Mean LDL-C was higher on androgenic steroids, 150 plus minus 44, than off, 125 plus minus 38 for pair differences. So LDL doesn't get as destroyed as HDL typically does on gear, but and especially not on orals. Their HDL gets destroyed much worse than on just straight up testosterone and nandrolone typically. But anyways, the ratio of LDL-C to HDL-C during exogenous steroid use, 6 plus minus 3.7, was nearly triple the ratio obtained when steroids were not taken. So obviously this is a result of the LDL going up, the HDL getting crushed, and the ratio between the two getting messed up. Widespread and habitual use of non-prescribed exogenous basically just saying what we already know. But what's interesting about this is it shows how long it took to recover to baseline and the effect that had. So obviously we've seen before in the study kind of detailing the past of what they found in previous research, like here, they noticed a reduction of HDL during therapy with stanozolol, which is Winstrol, a 17-alpha methyl androgenic anabolic steroid. hepatic triglyceride activities were pretty much screwed up. We already know that. In men, high-level habitual physical activity is associated with HDL-C increases. And then they're kind of just trying to figure out the framework of how anabolic androgenic steroids work on lipid modulation. And in this study, the design, 14 adult men, like I mentioned, 11 bodybuilders, 3 powerlifters, several of whom are state champions and ranked nationally. So these are high-level athletes, were evaluated serially in a family practice setting in rural Indiana. You would never see this study done now, but anyways, the healthy male subjects were, with one exception, non-smokers and primarily non-drinkers. All of them were highly conditioned and were studied during a continuous training period that included at least 2 hours of weightlifting and or isometrics daily. Each subject served as his own control. Measurement of lipids and lipoprotein cholesterols after a 12-hour fast were obtained. Blah, blah, blah. As summarized in Table 1, the subjects were first evaluated after taking the anabolics for at least 1 month, with most men taking these steroids for 1 to 2 months prior to competition. They were then restudied after discontinuation of steroids for at least 4 months. So this is a very long time frame to see how long it took HDL levels to recover. A variety of exogenous androgenic steroids were easily available at a local gymnasium and were obtained without prescription from a national mail order supermarket. All subjects took Dbol 50 to 100 milligrams per day, plus intramuscular testosterone enanthate 100 to 200 per week, and nandrolone decanoate 100 to 200 milligrams per week. Rarely 1,000 milligrams thymus extract per day was taken, but not for more than a few days, unlike the exogenous AAS, which were taken regularly. Blood samples obtained several days after the weekly self-administrations in an attempt to reflect the period of maximal drug effect. Because the men built up to yearly state and or national meets, it was possible to study them on their exogenous anabolic steroids and then to restudy them several months after cessation of steroids while they still maintained their habitual daily workouts, but were not taking steroids in preparation for competition. Although quantitative dietary recalls or records were not taken, qualitative dietary reviews were obtained when the subjects were sampled on and off self-administered steroids in an attempt to define circumstances under which the medications were observed. So this is like, as controlled as you're going to get for something like this. Like we have subjects taking 100 milligrams per day of Dbol, 200 milligrams of test, 200 milligrams of Deca per week. Like you're never going to see this study replicated with these kind of dosages and these kind of metrics. So we can see here the weight on and off, all the subjects here, their triglycerides, their LDL levels, their HDL levels, and we can just see how much of a massive difference it has when they're on versus off. So when they're on, they have LDL way higher than when they're off. And it's pretty consistent for the most part, with some of them being reversed, which is interesting. But anyways, for the most part, LDL is not going to be as negatively impacted as HDL. So it's a bit less consistent. And when you look at the HDL, we can see it's almost always, if not always, I haven't gone through all of these, but right now, let's see, 27 when they're on, 65 when they're off, 24 when they're on, 62 when they're off, 26 when they're on, they're at 63 when they're off, 28, 55, 30, 47, 25, 43. So this is like very, very consistent. This guy had a 92 that went down to 29 when he's on. Like that's brutal. 66 off, 35 on. So it's pretty rough, unfortunately, which is one of the main concerns we have with anabolics. And going down to the actual metrics of recovery too, like we can see and we already know it doesn't take a rocket scientist to predict that when you take 50 to 100 milligrams of Dbol per day, your HDL is going to be at least under 40. This guy, I don't know what he did, but he's lucky. Anyways, this guy was lucky, whatever he was doing. Seeing a 43 on that much gear is very, very unlikely from what I've seen. Now, going through this to find the actual metrics they go through, dietary patterns and whatnot and that kind of stuff, you can delve into further yourself if you want to. But what everyone's going to be watching for is to see how long it took HDL levels to return to baseline. So while they're on, it's less than 50% of when they're not on, essentially. When the men were restudied, having been off of the AAS for an average of 7.3 months, HDL-C levels were less than or equal to the 90th percentile in 7 of the 13 subjects, with 3 of the remaining 6 HDL-C levels being in the upper quartile of the age and sex-specific HDL-C distributions. So both, as mentioned, most of these guys had good HDL levels when they weren't on it, but it was pretty much determined the longer the subjects were off the anabolics, the greater their HDL levels were. So it's not just about dosage, it's also about duration of exposure and time off. So obviously you can crush your HDL levels pretty quick with exogenous anabolics, but it's also a very short little stint rest break doesn't necessarily bring them back to baseline. These findings suggested some limited residual effect of anabolics at an average of 7.3 months after cessation of their use. So even after 7.3 months, there were still lipid-hindering effects to some extent. In 8 of the 14 subjects, weight was lower while they were taking exogenous steroids, while in 6 it was higher. So that could be determined by if you're cutting or bulking and numerous different factors, but usually, obviously, just calories in versus calories out is kind of irrelevant to what we're talking about right now, though. With that being said, obviously, dietary practices will affect HDL and LDL levels to a large extent, but at the end of the day, we're still looking at the difference of on and off on a similar diet model per individual, I would assume. So steroid use usually paralleled increased training in preparation for competition, and where weight loss occurred, it probably reflected increased and caloric expenditure. So if you go down, you can actually see the conclusion and how long it took on average to get to baseline. Here it said HDL levels returned to baseline 5 weeks after discontinuation of anabolic steroid use. In our study, there was limited evidence of residual medication effect because the longer the men were off, the higher their HDL levels were, and the greater the difference was between HDL levels on and off of anabolics. And there was no evidence of residual drug effect on LDL, with no significant correlations between the number of months off anabolic steroids and either LDL-C or the ratio of LDL to HDL. So despite earlier in the study, it was basically saying that it had a residual effect at 7.3 months after cessation of use. It doesn't necessarily mean that the majority of recovery hadn't occurred within almost a month. So it took only 5 weeks for HDL levels to return to baseline, which honestly is kind of surprising considering the huge dosages being used here, like 100 milligrams of Dbol per day upwards, 100, 200 test, 200 Deca per week. Like that's a pretty heavy cycle, like, especially the oral dosage was insane. So like no one's really using that to begin with. And it still only took 5 weeks. Now this isn't justification at all to, stay on or do anything crazy. And in fact, most people blasting cruising may not even get back to this baseline because they're staying on HRT. So that is of note too, because these guys are fully cycling off. They're not staying on TRT replacement dosages, which is going to have a suppressive effect on your HDL and prevent that recovery to some extent. So, but with that being said, it's good to know that even in the, exposure to something this heavy duty and oral, 17 alpha alkylated, it took 5 weeks to recover to baseline HDL levels. So that's worth noting and keeping note of. So that's worth keeping note of at least, and is a, not something that's most people are going to have specific metrics on. Like if you ask somebody exactly how long is it going to take to recover from an oral cycle, no one's really going to have an exact answer. They might say, oh, time on equals time off and this and that. But having HDL return to baseline in 5 weeks is at least something that is good to know, because most people have no idea and would have no sort of guideline on understanding that kind of recovery process. So at the end of the day, this is a very interesting study that had parameters that would otherwise, from what I've seen, I've never seen a study really look at this elaborate detail of lipid modulation from a very heavy oral cycle like this, using compounds that are still leveraged today at dosages much higher than what is being used today. So very insightful in my opinion, was worth making a video about. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Please like, subscribe, check out my blog, moreplates.com. Follow me on Instagram at moreplates_moredates, Facebook, Snapchat, BitChute, Twitter, TikTok, Apple Podcast. If you listen to the podcast, please drop a 5-star rating. It really helps the algorithm there, as well as the comments and likes here on YouTube definitely help the algorithm here. So it's very much appreciated when you guys do that. If you want to get sent elaborate deep dives into bodybuilding pharmacology, I highly recommend you subscribe to the mailing list. It's the first link in the description below. It is a free newsletter that gets sent every time I publish an article. You're not going to get sent that if you don't sign up, and it has far more elaborate deep dives into pharmacology with concise subsections broken down into table of contents with all the clinical studies hyperlinked that I delve into that you can then click on yourself to do your own further research, and you're not going to get sent those articles and write-ups and studies otherwise if you don't sign up to the newsletter. So if you want to support the channel too, check out anything I'm associated with in the video description below, like my TRT clinic. If you have symptoms of low testosterone, or you simply want to optimize your health and performance, I would recommend you check it out. And the consults are free if you want to get a call and get like a quick assessment and then see if it's something that might be right for you. And then from there, you can get your blood work done, remit it back to them, and get it looked at by the doctor and figure out if you qualify for any kind of hormone optimization or what would benefit you specifically. And the patient care coordinators and doctor there are reflect the quality of information I put up on my channel. So I would highly recommend checking that out if you are interested in TRT, or you are a current TRT patient and want to swap over to a more knowledgeable clinic. They do free transfers. So you can check that out, and you can use coupon code MPMD50 to save $50 off of your first treatment if you go through them. As well as you can check out my Gorilla Mind nootropics and pre-workout formulas if you want to support the channel too. I literally sit on a Word document and write these out from scratch, and I stand behind them, and I would compel you to just compare your current pre-workout to mine, label for label, and you'll quickly see why we are going to be a industry leader soon in the pre-workout space as well as the nootropic space. So check those out. Thank you guys for watching. Talk to you soon.